Keanu Reeves walked into Elon Musk's prayer room. What happened next will break you. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The sky over Texas was unusually soft that evening. The sun dipped behind the hills like it was hiding, casting long shadows across Elon Musk's private compound, a vast and lonely stretch of land where innovation met isolation. Inside a secluded dome-shaped building at the far end of the property, there was silence. Not the sterile, humming silence of a lab, but something warmer, deeper. The kind of silence you walk into and feel in your chest before your ears. Musk's team called it the chapel, though it held no crosses, no stained glass. Just dim natural lighting, warm wood panels, and a small altar carved from stone. There were no security cameras. No visitors. Just Elon, seated on a floor cushion, eyes closed, hands resting loosely on his knees. Outside, footsteps approached, slow and steady. Keanu Reeves opened the heavy oak door and stepped inside without knocking. He wore black. Not as a statement, just as a habit. In his hands, he held a simple white candle and a small, folded piece of paper. His beard was a little scruffy. His eyes were distant, like he had just walked out of another world to be here. Elon didn't look up immediately. He must have known. Must have sensed who it was. They hadn't spoken in person in years. Keanu stood still for a moment, taking it all in, the room, the lighting, the man before him. He looked almost reverent. Not in a religious way. In a human way. As if the air in this room carried weight. Elon finally opened his eyes. There was no handshake. No smile. Just a nod, the kind of nod people give when words would only ruin it. Keanu spoke first. "I brought the candle," he said, his voice low. "You said, we should light one. For someone we've lost." Elon didn't answer with words. He simply gestured toward the altar. Keanu stepped forward and placed the candle on the cold stone surface. He didn't light it yet. Instead, he stood in silence, both hands resting on the edge of the altar, head slightly bowed. Elon watched him. And for a moment, two of the most recognized men in the world said nothing, and said everything. Elon hadn't planned on making the chapel public. It wasn't designed for headlines or documentaries. There were no announcements, no architecture awards, no tweets, just a quiet construction project on the far side of his Texas land. A circular space built mostly underground, open to the sky in the center, with no electricity, no glass, and no noise. He called it a grounding room, but it was more than that. It was where you went when the numbers stopped making sense, when the innovations lost meaning, and when even rocket launches felt hollow. It started after an interview, the one where, for the first time, he didn't talk about Mars, AI, or market disruptions. Instead, he stared into the camera and whispered, "I'd give it all back to ask her one more question." He meant his mother, May. The clip went viral. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others called it the first time Elon Musk looked human. But one man watched it differently. Quietly. Alone. Keanu Reeves was wrapping up filming in New Mexico when a crew member sent him the interview. He watched it at 2 a.m. in a dim trailer with lukewarm coffee in his hand. And something in Elon's voice, not the words, not the fame, hit a nerve. Not many people knew that Keanu still lit a candle every year on Jennifer's birthday. Not for publicity. Not even for healing. Just because silence needed somewhere to go. He sat down and wrote a letter to Elon that night. A few lines only. Something like, "Some grief doesn't expire. It just changes shape. I understand." But he never sent it. What would be the point? They weren't friends. Just two men orbiting the same world, speaking different languages. Still, the feeling stayed. Both men had lost someone. Both men had endured decades of attention and never truly been seen. They built, performed, gave, while quietly folding their pain into corners the public couldn't touch. Now, one had built a chapel. And the other had decided to walk into it. Not for a spectacle. Not for a headline, but because something old and unspoken had finally echoed loud enough to be heard. It was never supposed to be heard by the world. A private podcast, just Elon and a close friend, sitting in his studio after midnight, no script, no agenda. They talked about pressure, aging, mortality. The kinds of things billionaires aren't supposed to admit they think about. The friend asked, if you could sit and pray with anyone, who would it be? Elon chuckled first. Then grew still. He looked away from the mic and muttered, almost as if to himself. If there's one guy I wish I could sit and pray with, it'd be Keanu Reeves. He's seen more of life's pain than most monks. The podcast was meant to be unlisted. It was uploaded to a private server. But someone in the tech team made a mistake, or maybe a choice, and the clip slipped out. Within hours, it flooded Reddit, TikTok, and X. Commentators dissected every syllable. Was it real? Was it rehearsed? Was Elon finally opening up, or crafting a new brand? But behind all the noise, one man watched it quietly. Keanu sat in his LA apartment, feet up, watching the clip loop again on his phone. He didn't blink much. Didn't smile. He just stared, not at Elon's face, but through it. He didn't reply. Not on social media. Not through reps, not through publicists. 3 days later, Keanu got in his car and drove to Texas. He didn't alert anyone. Didn't book a hotel. Just pulled up to the edge of Elon's compound with a single candle, a folded note still inside his jacket pocket, and more silence than words. And now, in the quiet glow of the prayer room, Elon finally looked up. The men didn't embrace. They didn't exchange pleasantries. This wasn't a reunion, it was an arrival. Keanu stood at the altar and said softly, I brought the candle. You said we should light one for someone we've lost. Elon nodded, swallowing something behind his throat. They both sat on the cushions, side by side, back straight, hands resting gently on their knees. No chants. No speeches. Just the gravity of two lives that had carried more grief than most people knew. Keanu lit the candle. The flame flickered gently, as if hesitant at first, then held. For a few moments, they just watched it. Then Keanu spoke again. One word. A name. Jennifer. Elon didn't hesitate. May. Neither looked at the other. They just sat, shadows dancing across the stone wall as the candle burned brighter than it should have. And outside the chapel, the Texas wind moved softly, like it knew something sacred had just begun. The meeting was meant to stay silent. No press, no tweets, no cameras, just two men in a sacred moment far away from the noise. But silence doesn't survive long in the world they lived in. 3 days after Keanu's visit, a grainy photo appeared on a gossip blog. Blurry, overexposed, but unmistakable. Elon Musk and Keanu Reeves, walking side by side at dusk, leaving the far side of Elon's compound. Keanu's head was bowed slightly. Elon had his hand tucked behind his back. There were no smiles. Just solemnity. The photo had no context, no quote, no confirmation. And that's exactly why it exploded. Speculation flooded the internet. Is Elon starting a church? Is Keanu directing a documentary on Musk? Was it a grief retreat? A cult meeting? A billionaire ritual? The more people guessed, the more viral it became. But then something unexpected happened. Someone, a user named Lola Wakes Up, posted a simple message on Reddit. What if it was just two men grieving? I don't know why, but this picture made me light a candle for my dad. #light one for them. That last line stuck. Within hours, the hashtag began spreading. Not with celebrity gossip or mocking memes, but with photos. Thousands. Candles on kitchen counters. Candles in hospital rooms. On balconies, on sidewalks, in school dorms. Each with a caption. For my sister, Emily. For the friend I never got to say goodbye to. For the me I lost last year. The internet, so often cruel and chaotic, turned unexpectedly gentle. Hashtag Light One for them trended globally in 17 countries. People shared their stories and comments, fragments of pain, fragments of healing. The photo of Elon and Keanu became less about them, and more about everyone else. Everyone who had ever lit a candle with no audience. Elon and Keanu remained completely silent. Elon canceled all scheduled events that week. No press conferences. No live streams. No interviews. His staff was told not to comment. Keanu ducked every question thrown his way at airports or premieres. He only shook his head gently and kept walking. In public, they said nothing. And that silence only deepened the mystery, and the reverence. But in private, the silence was heavier. Inside his study, Elon stared at the leaked photo on his monitor. Zoomed in. Zoomed out. Watched it move slightly in GIFs online. Read the threads. Saw the candles. The comments. He should have felt moved. Maybe he did. But mostly, he felt exposed. He turned off the screen and whispered to no one. Did I just open a door I'm not ready to walk through? He feared what came next. Vulnerability had never been his domain. Algorithms, rockets, investments, those he could navigate. But this thing that had grown without structure, without code? He paced for hours that night. Meanwhile, across the country, Keanu sat in his small living room, staring at the same flickering image of that one candle, the one he'd lit for Jennifer. It felt like the moment had rippled far beyond what it was meant to. As if by opening his grief, he had triggered something far bigger, messier, more public than he could have ever wanted. He reread Elon's interview transcript from weeks ago. I'd give it all back to ask her one more question. He closed his eyes. Then whispered to himself. Did I help him, or just reopen the wound? And in that shared, separate silence, two men sat, each unsure whether what they had done was a blessing or a burden. It started with silence. Then came the scratches on the stone. 1 week after the photo went viral, Elon returned to the chapel and found the door slightly ajar. At first, he thought it was the wind. But as he stepped inside, his stomach turned. Spray paint, red, harsh, hurried, streaked across the back wall. Your billions won't save your soul. Fake profits with real money. God doesn't need your algorithms. They hadn't broken anything. No theft. No cameras caught it. Just those words, staring back at him like a judgment he wasn't ready for. Elon stood frozen in the middle of the room. The altar was untouched, but the silence was gone. Something sacred had been violated. He walked back out into the dusk without saying a word. That night, from his study, he sent a message to Keanu. I think I made a mistake. This isn't me. He watched the screen. 3 dots didn't appear. No typing. Nothing. Keanu didn't reply right away. He was back in his modest Los Angeles home, standing in front of a photo he rarely talked about, Jennifer, smiling in a way that only existed in memories now. He kept it framed, not out of nostalgia, but because it reminded him who he used to be. Who he had lost. He held his phone, reading Elon's message. He didn't type anything. Not yet. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, lit a candle from the drawer, and placed it near the photo. The flame wavered once, then steadied. He sat at the table and opened his notebook, the one with the folded letter he'd once written to Elon and never sent. At the top, he'd scribbled the words from that podcast clip. He's seen more of life's pain than most monks. He read them again. Not with pride. With understanding. Finally, he picked up his phone and typed. No mistake. Just an echo that finally got heard. It was sent. Back in Texas, Elon read it without blinking. He didn't respond. Didn't call his assistant. Didn't post. He simply stood, stepped outside, and walked the long path back to the chapel. Alone. No guards. No lights. He opened the door, stepped inside, and sat back down on the same cushion where Keanu once sat. He didn't clean the wall. He just sat and let the silence return. The next morning, as the sun stretched gold across the hills, Elon returned to the chapel for the third time in 2 days. He didn't expect anything new, maybe just the same silence, the same red marks on the wall that he still hadn't erased. But something different caught his eye. Pinned carefully to the wooden door was a small, folded piece of paper. Handwritten. No signature. No fanfare. Just 8 words, in soft black ink. Some lights don't go viral. They just stay lit. He stood still for a moment, reading it again and again. Then he opened the door, stepped inside, and without a word, tacked the note to the inner wall of the chapel, just above where the candle had once burned. He didn't tell anyone. But something shifted in him. That night, instead of opening X, instead of checking markets or forecasts, Elon logged into an old Medium blog he hadn't touched in 6 years. A dusty corner of the internet where no one looked for him anymore. He wrote slowly. Carefully. No editors. No assistants. The title read, What I Learned from a Candle. He didn't name names. Didn't talk about Reeves, or the photo, or the vandalism. He didn't defend himself or explain the prayer room. Instead, he wrote about quiet grief, the kind that doesn't scream but hums under everything. He talked about legacy, about how even those with all the tools to build empires can still be terrified of being forgotten. He talked about silence, and how sometimes, the most honest question isn't why, but what now? He hit publish at 2:11 a.m. The post didn't trend. It didn't go viral. There were no retweets, no headlines. But it reached the people who were meant to read it. A week later, Elon received a message in his inbox. From a hospice nurse in Vermont. I don't usually read blogs. But I read yours last night after sitting with a patient who asked me if anyone would remember her. Your candle reminded me how. Thank you. Elon stared at the message for a long time. He didn't reply. Instead, he printed it out and quietly pinned it to the chapel wall, right below the handwritten note. And that night, for the first time in weeks, he lit a candle of his own. Weeks passed. The frenzy faded. Hashtags died down. The photo disappeared into the ocean of other viral moments the world had already forgotten. News cycles moved on. People lit fewer candles now. The trend had slowed. But not for Keanu. On a cloudy afternoon, far from the cameras and red carpets, he stepped quietly into a modest community church tucked between aging bookstores and quiet cafes. The kind of place where the pews creaked when you sat down, and no one cared who you were, only that you had come to sit in the quiet. There were no photographers. No whispers. Just the soft scent of old wood, and the distant sound of a pipe organ humming softly in the background. Keanu walked slowly toward the small rack of candles near the altar. Most were unlit. A few flickered. He lit one. He didn't rush. His hands were steady. Familiar with the ritual. Then, instead of kneeling or walking away, he drifted to the very back of the church and sat down in the last pew, alone. A few moments passed. A priest, older, kind-eyed, and quiet in his steps, noticed him. He walked over gently, leaned in, and asked in a near whisper. Is this for someone? Keanu looked up, and his expression held something between peace and ache. A half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, but didn't need to. He replied. Yes. But not just one person. The priest nodded, said nothing more, and walked away. And Keanu remained, watching the single candle flicker at the front of the church. The scene held. No applause. No grand finale. Just one man sitting with 1,000 echoes. And as the screen darkened, a voice, quiet, reflective, and almost like an inner thought, filled the silence. Sometimes, the loudest prayers aren't spoken. Sometimes, the brightest lights aren't meant to be seen. Sometimes, healing begins with silence.